The morning of September 52 BC arrived cold and still over the plateau of Montauxois, the kind of cold that settles into iron armour and stays there, that makes every breath visible and every sound carry further than it should. Below the walls of the Gallic hilltop town of Alesia, somewhere in the darkness before dawn, 80,000 warriors were waking to their sixth week of siege, their grain gone, their horses already slaughtered and eaten, the rivers on both sides of the plateau running quiet and indifferent in the valley below. And surrounding them, dug into the earth in a continuous ring 18 kilometers long, stood the Romans, not simply camped, fortified. Walls, flooded ditches, sharpened stakes, and 23 watchtowers loaded with artillery. All of it built in 3 weeks by men who understood that engineering and patience were more reliable than courage alone. Beyond those Romans, a second wall faced the other direction, because somewhere out on the roads of Gaul, a relief army was coming. Julius Caesar had trapped himself between two enemies on purpose. What he was about to attempt had never been done before in the history of Western warfare, and the outcome would reshape a continent. Stay with me. It is early morning in late September 52 BC. The plateau of Montauxois rises out of the Burgundian mist, flat on top and steep on every side, with river valleys tucking in close from the north and the south. The Ouse River runs along the base of the northern slope. The Oseraine cuts along the south. Up on top, behind the stone and timber walls of the Gallic hilltop town called Alesia, somewhere between 80,000 Gallic warriors and the entire civilian population of the Mandubii tribe have been awake since before dawn. Not because they chose to be, because there is nothing left to eat, and hunger does that to people. The grain ran out 5 days ago. Before that, the horses were slaughtered. Not the cavalry mounts. Those were sent out weeks earlier, before the siege closed, riding hard for every corner of Gaul. The draft animals, whatever could be eaten, was eaten, and now that too is gone. Below the plateau walls, arranged in a ring that stretches 18 kilometers around the base of the hill, stand the Romans. And they are not simply camped there. In the 3 weeks after Julius Caesar's legions arrived, they dug 2 water-filled ditches in front of a 4-meter timber and earthwork wall, planted 5 rows of camouflaged pit traps lined with sharpened stakes in front of the ditches, scattered iron caltrops across the ground between the pits, erected 23 watchtowers along the wall, and mounted arrow-firing torsion artillery in each one. Every 50 feet, a Scorpion ballista, loaded and crewed. That inner ring faces inward, toward Alesia. And then there is the outer ring, because Caesar knew the moment he arrived at Montauxois that a relief army was coming. Vercingetorix, the Arvernian king who had unified nearly all of Gaul against Rome, had sent his cavalry out through a gap in the Roman lines before the siege closed. 12,000 horsemen riding to every tribe in Gaul with one instruction: send everyone you have to Alesia. Caesar's response was to order the construction of a second continuous wall, same specifications, facing the opposite direction. 14 Roman miles of it, 21 kilometers, encircling his own army from the outside. A wall to keep the Gauls on the hill in. A wall to keep the rest of Gaul out. Beyond that outer wall, the relief army has now arrived. Caesar will later claim it numbered 248,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even the most conservative modern estimate puts it at 80,000 to 100,000 fighters. against the 40,000 to 55,000 Romans inside the double rings. That is a force twice their size, attacking from outside alone, before counting the 80,000 men on the hill pushing from within. The Romans are trapped between a force twice their size on the plateau and a force that may be 4 times their size outside the walls. There is no line of retreat, no supply road, no allied territory within marching distance. Caesar has burned every bridge, in every sense. For the first time in Western warfare, a besieging army had deliberately fortified itself into a position where it too was besieged, on purpose, by its own commander, as a calculated strategic choice. What happened in the following days on this mist-covered plateau in eastern Gaul didn't just decide whether Rome could hold the territory it had spent 7 brutal years conquering. It decided the language your ancestors would eventually speak, the legal tradition that would govern the continent they lived on, and what kind of civilization would emerge from the wreckage of the Celtic world. This battle changed Europe forever. To understand what brought 130,000 to 330,000 men to this particular hill in Burgundy in the fall of 52 BC, you have to understand 2 things: what Julius Caesar actually needed from Gaul, and why the Gauls were finally able to unite against him in the way they never had before. Start with Caesar. In 59 BC, at roughly 40 years old, he completed his term as consul of Rome, the highest elected office in the Republic. He was well-liked, well-connected, and broke. Spectacularly, dangerously broke. Not the kind of broke that means you watch your spending. The kind where your creditors include Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Roman world, and the amounts you owe are enough to finance a small war. Caesar had spent years in deliberate, calculated debt, funding gladiatorial games, bankrolling political allies, building public monuments, buying influence at every level of Roman society. It was an investment strategy, and it required a return. Through the political arrangement historians call the First Triumvirate, his alliance with Crassus and the general Pompey, Caesar engineered his appointment as proconsul of 3 provinces simultaneously: Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy, Illyricum on the Adriatic coast, and Gallia Narbonensis in southern France. The standard proconsular term was 1 year. Caesar's was 5. He was being handed a standing army and the legal authority to use it for half a decade, in one of the most resource-rich and least pacified regions adjacent to Roman territory. Gaul, the broad territory roughly corresponding to modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, was inhabited by several dozen Celtic tribes with iron ore, silver deposits, enormous agricultural output, and a population that could be enslaved on a large scale. For a proconsul with debt obligations and political ambitions, it was an opportunity. The official justifications for intervention were always available, and Caesar used every one of them. From 58 to 53 BC, he fought through Gaul with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that speed and aggression were his best tools. He defeated the migrating Helvetii at Bibracte in 58 BC. He expelled the Germanic king Ariovistus. He crushed the Belgic coalition of northern Gaul in 57 BC in a series of hard fights. He crossed the Rhine in 55 BC on a bridge his engineers built in 10 days. Not because it was militarily necessary, but because nobody had done it before, and the political audience in Rome needed to hear about it. He launched 2 expeditions to Britain. Tribe by tribe, coalition by coalition, He ground down Gallic resistance over 7 years. And in 53 BC, Caesar formally declared that Gaul was now a Roman province. Not an allied territory, not a client state, a province, subject to Roman administrative law, Roman taxation, and Roman religious regulation. For the Druids, the priestly class that held Gallic society together as judges, arbiters of tribal disputes, keepers of oral tradition, and custodians of the sacred sites. This was existential. Every year, somewhere in the territory of the Carnutes tribe, at the geographic centre of Gaul, the Druids gathered to conduct religious observances and mediate disputes that bound the confederation together. They were the neutral ground. When two tribes had a conflict too large to resolve between themselves, the Druids were the authority both sides would accept. When a young Gallic aristocrat needed an education, it was the Druids who provided it. A process that could take up to 20 years, because everything they taught was committed to memory, nothing written down. This was not an accident. The prohibition on writing sacred knowledge was deliberate. It was the institution's method of preserving its own irreplaceability. If Roman law governed the Carnutes' sacred site, the thing that held Gaul above the level of individual tribal rivalries was gone. Roman administrators would bring Roman priests. Roman courts would handle Gallic disputes according to Roman procedure. The Druids had no role in that world. And without the Druids, the annual gathering at the centre of Gaul had no mediating function, which meant the tribes were, once again, simply rivals, competing for land and resources. That is what Gaul was afraid of. Not taxation, not military occupation, the threat to the sacred centre. The man that threat produced was Vercingetorix. He was the son of Celtillus, the most powerful figure in the Arverni tribe, one of the dominant tribes in south-central Gaul, who had been executed by his own people for attempting to make himself a permanent king, rather than serving in the annual elective magistracy that Arvernian society used to govern itself. His name in Gaulish meant something close to the Great Chief of the Brave, though whether that name was given at birth or acquired through reputation is not something the sources clarify. Vercingetorix grew up knowing his father died for reaching too far, and watching Caesar methodically dismantle the civilization around him. He had spent time in Caesar's own company, close enough to understand how the Roman commander thought, where the army's real vulnerabilities lay, and what conditions would be required to exploit them. He was not naive about what he was starting. He understood that the Gauls had never successfully resisted Caesar when their armies met in open field, and he designed his strategy around that understanding rather than against it. In early 52 BC, his pro-Roman uncle, Gobanitio, expelled him from the Arvernian capital of Gergovia before he could act. He went to the countryside, gathered supporters, came back, drove his opponents out, and seized power. He sent messengers to every tribe in Gaul. Delegates came from the Senones, the Parisii, the Pictones, the Cadurci, the Turones, the Lemovices, tribe after tribe across the entire territory. Even the Aedui sent delegates, Rome's most consistently loyal Gallic allies for decades, which tells you everything about how thoroughly the mood had shifted. The coalition that assembled in the winter of 52 BC was the first genuinely unified Gallic resistance in the history of the Roman presence in the region. The strategy Vercingetorix brought to that coalition was the product of careful analysis. He had identified the Roman army's structural vulnerability: supply. Caesar's legions in deep Gaul ran on foraging and local grain purchases, far from reliable supply lines. Deny food and forage, and Roman mobility died. No pitched battles. That was how every previous Gallic uprising had ended, in a field somewhere, with Roman discipline and formation grinding through Gallic courage, regardless of how strong the individual warriors were. Instead, destroy the grain stores, burn the villages, kill the livestock. Let Gallic cavalry shred every Roman foraging party. Starve the army in the countryside. He put it to the tribal council directly. They would burn their own crops and their own villages rather than let them fall to Roman foragers. Sacrifice everything. It was harsh enough that some pushed back. The Bituriges refused to burn their great city, Avaricum. Vercingetorix was overruled and let them defend it, reluctantly. Caesar besieged it in winter rain and cold, took it in 25 days, and allowed his soldiers to sack it. Ancient sources record roughly 40,000 dead. Vercingetorix returned to the council and said, "I told you." The coalition held. Then came Gergovia. Caesar arrived at the Arvernian capital in spring 52 BC and attempted a siege. What happened is partly obscured by the fact that our only detailed source is Caesar himself, who had every reason to frame events in his favour. What we know: his men launched a direct assault on the walls and were thrown back with approximately 700 dead, including 46 centurions, the experienced unit leaders who made legions function at the tactical level. Losing 46 in one afternoon was serious. Caesar retreated. It was the only clear defeat of his Gallic campaigns. The political consequences arrived immediately. The Aedui formally switched sides and declared for Vercingetorix. Their cavalry and grain stores were now unavailable to Rome. Caesar consolidated his forces, called up Germanic cavalry allies, and marched north to link up with his subordinate Titus Labienus. Vercingetorix assembled 15,000 cavalry and sent them to intercept Caesar's column. The engagement, historians call it the Battle of the Vosgian, came close to working. The Gallic horse hit Caesar's column on the front and both flanks simultaneously. But the Germanic auxiliaries on the right flank drove uphill into the Gallic right wing and broke it. And when the right collapsed, the other two formations came apart. 15,000 Gallic horsemen scattered. Without cavalry, the harassment strategy had no delivery mechanism. Vercingetorix pulled his 80,000 infantry to the oppidum of Alesia on Mont Auxois. He had a plan. Hold the plateau long enough for a relief army to assemble and arrive, then strike from inside at the exact moment the relief force struck from outside. A pincer, classical and potentially lethal. Caesar arrived at the base of Mont Auxois, looked at the terrain and started digging. The plateau of Mont Auxois runs roughly 1,500 metres east to west and about 600 metres north to south, large enough to hold a substantial town, fields and storage. The Auze River runs along the northern base. The Auze runs along the south. Both rivers rule out rapid approach from those directions. You would have to cross water and then climb a steep slope under fire from above. The eastern end of the plateau is the steepest. The western end faces the plain of Les Laumes, roughly 3 miles of flat, open ground, the only direction from which an assault or relief force could approach in any real formation. The northern approach creates a problem Caesar cannot fully solve. A secondary ridge called Mont Rea runs northwest from the main plateau, too steep and irregular for a continuous fortification line without more time than he has available. When the inner wall is built, there will be a weakness at the northwestern corner. 2 Roman legions holding a camp on ground where the hill slopes toward them, giving the attackers, rather than the defenders, the gradient advantage. Caesar saw all of this the day he arrived. He looked at the plateau, the Murus Gallicus walls, the rivers, the terrain. A direct assault on 80,000 warriors behind stone and timber walls on a steep hill was not viable. Siege and starvation were the only path. The question was how to make the siege inescapable, given the certainty of a relief force. His answer, and nothing quite like it had been done before at this scale, was to build 2 complete rings of fortification simultaneously. An inner ring facing the plateau to contain the garrison. An outer ring facing open country to stop the relief army. Between the 2 rings, his army would hold the interior lines and reinforce any threatened point faster than an external force could reach it. The inner ring, the circumvallation, ran approximately 18 kilometers around the base of Mont Auxois. The construction was systematic. Clear ground, stake the line, dig trench, pile rampart, drive palisade. The finished wall stood 4 meters high, with a timber fighting platform on its inner face. In front of it, the engineers dug 2 V-profile ditches, each 4.5 meters wide and 4.5 meters deep. V-profile is specifically hostile to assault. The narrow bottom makes it nearly impossible to stand and swing a weapon, and the steep sides turn controlled movement into a scramble. The outer ditch was left dry as the primary obstacle. The inner ditch was flooded, fed by channels cut from the Ouse and Oseraine rivers. In front of the ditches, the engineers dug pit traps, 5 rows in a diagonal pattern, each pit roughly 3 feet deep and conical, with a fire-hardened stake at the bottom and a camouflaging cover of woven brush and a thin layer of soil laid across the top to make them indistinguishable from solid ground. The soldiers called them lilies, lilia in Latin. Whatever the humor behind the name, the design was functional. A man moving forward quickly in the dark, stepping through the brush cover, dropped 3 feet onto a sharpened stake. Between the pit rows, iron caltrops, small 4-pointed iron objects designed so that however they fell, at least one point faced upward, were scattered through the grass. A sandaled foot landing on a caltrop would be impaled. A man falling into a lily would land on a stake. Someone crossing the flooded ditch would be slowed and exposed. Every element of the forward obstacle belt was designed to interact with the others, funneling attackers into killing zones. 23 towers went up at intervals along the wall, each equipped with scorpion ballistae, torsion-powered bolt throwers that worked on the principle of a large crossbow, operated by a crew of 2 or 3, capable of firing an iron-tipped bolt with enough force to penetrate body armor at close range. In a siege context, with assault groups packed in ditches or pushing across exposed ground, a scorpion crew maintaining 4 or 5 aimed shots per minute could systematically dismantle an advance. Caesar positioned them to cover every angle of approach along the inner ring, with overlapping fields of fire between adjacent towers. The inner ring was built in approximately 3 weeks, while Gallic cavalry from the garrison sortied repeatedly to disrupt the work. Caesar screened his engineers with infantry legions standing in formation between the workers and the plateau, while his Germanic cavalry chased off the Gallic horsemen. The construction ran in continuous shifts. The Romans treated fortification as a tactical requirement on par with fighting, and every legionary was trained in the tools and techniques of military engineering. This was not a separate specialist function. It was a core competency of every Roman unit in the field. Before the inner ring was complete, Vercingetorix made his most important single decision of the siege. Through a gap not yet closed, he sent his entire cavalry force, 12,000 horses, riding to every tribe in Gaul with orders to send every available man to Alesia by a specific date. The grain inside the oppidum, he calculated, would last roughly 30 days. The cavalry had to move fast. The moment Caesar learned of the cavalry's escape, he ordered construction of the outer ring, the contravallation, 21 kilometers of identical fortification facing outward, incorporating 4 cavalry camps and 8 larger fortified strongpoints at the most tactically critical positions. The Romans were now inside both rings, besieging the hill from within a position designed to hold off the relief from without. Now consider who was doing that building and what they were carrying. Caesar commanded 10 legions by 52 BC, none at full strength. A nominally complete legion fielded around 4,800 to 5,000 legionaries. After 7 years of campaign losses, illness, and administrative detachments, most were running at 2,500 to 3,500 effectives. His total force at Alesia, including Germanic and Gallic cavalry auxiliaries, was probably between 40,000 and 55,000 men. Every legionary carried standardized equipment, and that standardization was itself a force multiplier. His helmet, a Montefortino or Culus type, was an iron bowl covering the skull and neck, with cheek guards and a brow guard that deflected downward blows. His body armour was the Lorica Hamata, a mail shirt of interlocked iron rings reaching to mid-thigh, heavy enough to stop most direct cuts, flexible enough for the full range of movement Roman close-order combat demanded. He carried the scutum, the large curved rectangular shield, roughly 4 feet tall, made from laminated wood covered in leather and edged in iron, with a central boss that served as both structural reinforcement and a punching weapon in close work. The gladius hispaniensis, about 22 inches of double-edged iron with a sharply pointed tip, was designed for thrusting in close quarters. It was a short weapon on purpose. In the press of close-order infantry combat, a man with a longer slashing sword cannot use its full length because there is no room to swing it. A man with a gladius can thrust into the torso from 18 inches when the opponent's balance is broken by the scutum. Each legionary also carried 2 pila, the Roman throwing javelin, about 2 meters long with a wooden shaft topped by a long iron shank ending in a pyramidal head. The shank was thin enough that the point would pass through a shield face and either strike the man behind it or embed in the shield and drag it down. Throw the first at 15 meters, the second at 10. Close with the gladius before the opponent recovers. Archaeological excavation at Alesia recovered actual pila from the base of the fortification lines, lying where they fell after being thrown at assault groups in the ditches below. Against all of this stood the Gallic warriors inside Alesia, and the relief army assembling outside. Gallic military equipment was not standardized. Aristocratic warriors might carry iron mail shirts, helmets of the culus and port types, and the characteristic Laten longsword, a broad-profiled iron blade designed for slashing from horseback. Against a Roman shield wall in close formation, it was less effective because the Romans trained specifically to deny the space a slashing weapon requires. Common infantry carried a spear, an oval shield, and a shorter secondary blade. Slingers and archers provided suppressive fire. Equipment varied widely across the tribal contingents because there was no standardized Gallic supply system. Men brought what they owned. The 4 commanders appointed over the relief force were Commius of the Atrebates, a chieftain who had previously served as a Roman client and knew Caesar personally from the British expeditions; Viridomarus and Epidaurus of the Aedui, representing the tribe that had finally abandoned its long Roman alliance; and Decisive of the Arverni, a cousin of Vercingetorix, and the man who would bear the most critical tactical responsibility when the time came. 4 commanders in joint authority over a force whose exact size has been debated ever since Caesar wrote it down. Caesar's own figure, 248,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, is treated with skepticism by modern historians, who note that feeding and moving 250,000 men through the roads of Gaul in late summer would have strained the logistical capacity of the region almost to the breaking point. More careful estimates place the relief force at somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 actual combatants. The lower end of that range is still twice the size of Caesar's entire force, attacking from the outside alone. In late September, the relief army crested the hills west of Caesar's outer ring and came into view of the Lelome plain. From the plateau walls of Alesia, the starving garrison watched campfire after campfire appear in the darkness below. Then more. Then the long, spreading constellation of a very large army settling in for the night. Men who had been holding walls for 6 weeks on empty stomachs saw those fires and understood what they meant. Vercingetorix had delivered on his promise. The rest of Gaul had come. The pincer was set. Both halves were in place. All that remained was to close it. The morning after the relief army arrived, the plain of Lelome filled with horses. 8,000 Gallic cavalry spread across the flat ground west of Caesar's outer wall and moved to engagement range of the Roman lines. Behind them, the relief army's infantry deployed from camp and took position on a broad front, filling the plain from the western slopes of the ridge to the river valley in the north. From the plateau walls of Alesia, it worked on the men watching. Look at what is coming for you. Vercingetorix ordered the garrison into motion. Warriors moved down toward the inner Roman ring, carrying the assault equipment prepared during the waiting weeks. Bundled fascines to fill the flooded ditch, wooden boarding to cover the lily pits, long iron-hooked poles to pull at the palisade. Caesar opened the gates in his outer ring and sent his own cavalry onto the plain. The Germanic auxiliaries were in the Roman formation, and they were the best horsemen on the field. What followed was a continuous mounted engagement across the Lelome plain from roughly midday to sunset. 7 or 8 hours of combat across ground that suited cavalry perfectly. Neither side broke the other. By evening, both forces pulled back. But the day had accomplished something for the Gallic commanders that was not immediately obvious. Their riders had gotten close to every section of Caesar's outer ring. At the northwestern side, at the foot of Morea, they found what they were looking for: the gap. 2 Roman legions holding a camp on ground that sloped toward the defenders rather than away from them. The place where the terrain had forced compromises in the construction. The Gallic commanders filed that away and began planning around it. That night, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix made the decision that historians still discuss. The non-combatants, the civilian Mandubii population, the people whose town this was, would be expelled. Every mouth that was not a fighting mouth was consuming reserves belonging to the warriors. The Mandubii would go to Caesar's lines and offer themselves as slaves in exchange for food. They walked through the oppidum gates, down the plateau, across the open ground to the circumvallation, and asked to be let through. Caesar refused. No food, no open gate. No response. They could not go back. Vercingetorix had expelled them. They could not go forward. Caesar would not admit them. They stayed in the no-man's land between the town walls and the Roman wall. Caesar's text mentions their expulsion and does not mention them again. The military logic was precise. Keeping them there added to the pressure on the garrison without costing the Romans anything. Allowing them through would have removed that pressure. Caesar was not arbitrary in his cruelty. He was careful. Phase 2. The Night Attack. Midnight, the second night of the relief army's presence. No moon or close to it. The Gallic commanders had determined that darkness was their best cover. The Scorpion ballistae in the Roman towers required aim, and you cannot aim what you cannot see. The relief army moved from their camp in silence, infantry only, no cavalry, which would have been heard from half a mile away, and advanced toward the full length of Caesar's outer ring simultaneously. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched a night sortie from the oppidum. His garrison came out of the gates and moved toward the inner Roman wall from above. 2 attacks at once. Outer ring from outside, inner ring from inside. The pincer in its first real test. The Romans heard it coming. Thousands of men in hobnailed sandals and iron equipment moving through darkness is not subtle, and Caesar's sentries were rotated frequently and alert. The alarm went up along both walls simultaneously. The watchtower scorpions began firing into the darkness by sound. The crews could hear the direction of approach and send bolts in flat trajectories along the most likely lines of advance. From the fighting platforms, legionaries stood ready with pila. The Gallic attack hit in waves. Slingers came first, running close and launching lead bullets and river stones in high arcing volleys designed to drive Roman defenders below the parapet, to force them into a crouch behind the wall rather than standing to throw. The sound of a lead sling bullet in flight is a low, rapid whirring. The impact on iron or timber was sharp and loud. Under that sustained fire, the tower scorpion crews kept working, and the legionaries on the wall returned fire with pila at the shapes below them. The assault groups reached the outer ditches. They threw earth into them, hauled brush and bundled sticks forward to lay on the wet surface of the flooded ditch, trying to build crossings under fire. Gallic warriors in tight linked shield formations pushed through the lily pit fields, and the pits took them. Men stepping through the brush, covering and dropping 3 feet onto stakes, the weight of the men behind pushing the front ranks forward over the fallen. The diagonal pit pattern had been designed to funnel movement toward them, and in the dark, without torches, it worked. Mark Antony commanded the threatened sector on the outer wall that night. His cohorts held. The relief army pressed for hours, failed to cross the flooded ditch in force anywhere along the front, and withdrew before dawn. On the inner wall, Vercingetorix's sortie had made better progress. The garrison knew the terrain immediately outside their own walls, but they too failed to breach the circumvallation in force. Both attacks had failed. Dawn revealed what the 2 walls had absorbed overnight. Assault marks on the palisade facing, arrows and sling bullets embedded in the timber, evidence of multiple crossing attempts at the ditches, the lily pits in front of both walls partially exposed, some filled with the results of men who had fallen through them. The Scorpion crews counted remaining bolt supplies. Legionaries collected undamaged pila from the ground below the wall, where they had landed after being thrown, and passed them back up for the next engagement. Engineers moved the length of both rings, assessing damage, patching the worst sections with timber from the camp stores. Caesar spent the morning redistributing. He moved additional cohorts to the Mont Rea camp, knowing it was where the next serious attempt would come. He repositioned cavalry reserves inside the outer ring, so they could reach the northwestern sector within minutes of a signal. He walked the perimeter. He was not simply reacting, he was anticipating, which is what made him dangerous. The Gauls inside Alesia had now been under siege for more than 5 weeks. The grain was gone. The horses had been eaten. There was nothing left to ration.
The warriors on the walls were fighting on whatever physical reserves a human body can draw on after weeks of inadequate food. Discipline held, but the margin was shrinking. Every day that passed without a breach in the Roman lines was a day the garrison became a fraction less capable of the kind of coordinated assault that the pincer required. In the Gallic camp outside the walls, the 4 commanders, Commius, Viridomarus, Epidaurus, and Vercassivellaunus, reviewed what the night attack had told them. Broad front assault against prepared Roman defences was not going to work. The Romans held interior lines and could reinforce any point faster than an external force could maintain pressure from outside. What was needed was concentration. Maximum force on one point at the exact moment the garrison concentrated on one point from inside, so Caesar could not strip reserves from one threat to deal with the other. The point was Mont Rea. Vercassivellaunus, cousin of Vercingetorix, our Vernian commander, was given the mission. He would take a substantial assault force, move it in darkness around the western end of Mont Rea to the reverse slope of the ridge, conceal it there, rest it through the night and morning, and wait for the signal. The signal would be a diversionary attack in force across the plain, pulling Caesar's attention and reserves southward. Vercingetorix would simultaneously launch a maximum effort sortie from the oppidum. Then, and only then, Vercassivellaunus would bring the concealed force over the ridge crest and down onto the northwestern camp. It was the right plan. Given the constraints, it was close to the only plan that could work. Vercassivellaunus left camp after dark. The column moved through the night without torches, without noise, picking its way around the western end of Mont Rea to the reverse slope of the ridge, the face hidden from every Roman sentry line. They settled behind the ridge crest before dawn and rested in place. Caesar's account gives the date on the Roman calendar as September 23rd. Modern scholars correlate this to approximately August 30th by our reckoning. By mid-morning, the Gallic cavalry filled the lay loam plain again, and the relief army's infantry moved against the southern and western sections of the outer ring in force. The diversion, real enough that it demanded Roman attention and cost casualties on both sides, pulled Caesar's eye and his available reserve cohorts toward the south and southwest. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the diversion begin from the plateau walls and opened the oppidum gates. His garrison came out carrying everything: boarding for the pits, fascines for the ditches, hooks, rams, every siege tool his carpenters had built during the waiting weeks. They hit the inner ring at every point that showed weakness, concentrating where the previous assaults had already stressed the structure. It was noon. Vercassivellaunus moved. He had let his men rest through the night and all of the morning, a deliberate choice that paid for itself in the energy they brought to the assault. An ancient army that has marched through the night and been committed to battle immediately is not the same army as one that marched in the night and slept until midday. The men on the reverse slope of Mont Rea were rested. They were also concealed. No Roman sentry on the outer ring could see the north face of the ridge from their position. No patrol had come close enough to discover them. The concealment had held perfectly. The assault force came over the crest of Mont Rhea at pace. Caesar records the number as 60,000 men. Most modern historians estimate it closer to 30,000. Whatever the figure, it was a large body running downhill toward a Roman camp held by 2 legions, on ground that tilted toward the attackers. The defenders saw them coming from a distance and sent runners to Caesar immediately. The attack hit hard. Lead elements formed testudo, shields locked overhead and at the sides, dense groups pushing through the lily pits and across the forward ditch under scorpion fire from the towers. They threw earth against the base of the palisade to reduce the effective wall height. Iron hooks grabbed at the timber facing. Men with axes worked at the base. The slingers at the rear maintained a sustained volley against the tower crews, forcing them to fire quickly rather than carefully. The assault formation rotated fresh men to the front as the leading elements wore down. The defenders could not do the same. The Roman garrison's pillar supply ran low. Arms tired on the parapet. The 2 legions at the northwestern camp were fighting at full stretch. Caesar sent Labienus, his most trusted and experienced subordinate, with 6 cohorts. Labienus arrived and held the line, but barely. Caesar sent Brutus with 6 more cohorts. Then Gaius Fabius with 7. 15 to 19 cohorts flowing into the northwest, which meant other sections of the outer ring were being thinned. Vercingetorix, watching from above, redirected his garrison's sortie toward those thinned sections. For perhaps an hour, both Roman walls were simultaneously undermanned and overpressed. Caesar made his calculation. He took 4 cohorts from the nearest camp, what was left after the transfers to Labienus, and gave the Germanic cavalry a divided order. Half were to reinforce the northwestern camp from inside the outer ring. The other half were to ride around the outside of Mont Rhea, around the entire ridge, and strike Vercassivalonis from the rear. Then he rode toward the northwest himself in his paludamentum, the scarlet commander's cloak. Scarlet because it was visible at distance through dust and confusion. His men could see him from 200 meters away through the noise of a wall under assault, and they knew what it meant when the general arrived at their section of wall. A cohort under maximum pressure makes continuous individual calculations about when to hold and when to yield ground. The general's presence at that specific wall tells every man on it that this is the most important point in the entire 30-mile perimeter today. It changes what people do. His account says his men told him afterward they had never faced a closer thing. Vercassivalonis's men had earth piled against the palisade base in multiple places, and were over the wall in some sections, fighting legionaries hand to hand on the parapet. Tower crews had switched from scorpion bolts to hand weapons because the range was too close for artillery. Caesar arrived with 4 cohorts and extended the line. His men saw the scarlet cloak. Then the Germanic cavalry appeared behind the assault force. Vercassivalonis's column had been fighting uphill against a prepared position for 2 to 3 hours. Men toward the rear were exhausted from the night march, the long concealment, and hours under missile fire. They could hear fighting to the south and west. The diversion was still ongoing, but they could not see behind them. Every piece of their attention was on the wall in front. The Germanic horsemen came over the ground from the east and hit the rear of the column. In the vocabulary of ancient infantry combat, cavalry striking a committed formation from behind while it is fully engaged frontally is as close to an instant catastrophe as the battlefield offers. The front ranks cannot turn. The wall is immediately before them, and turning exposes the unshielded side. The rear ranks turn and find horses coming fast, striking downward. The middle has nowhere to go. The formation does not break gradually. It collapsed. Their Cassivelaunus was captured, not killed, taken prisoner, which will matter 6 years later in Rome. Caesar's cavalry continued to work through the broken formation, cutting men down or driving them up the slope. The units that had been over the palisade in the northwestern camp, the ones that had broken through, were now isolated. Behind them, the formation had collapsed. In front of them was a wall full of Roman legionaries who had just seen their situation reverse. Those men who had crossed the palisade found themselves fighting with no support and nowhere to go. The camp was cleared. From the plateau walls, Vercingetorix watched the assault on Monrea disintegrate. He watched the Germanic cavalry working through the rear of the column. He watched the assault force streaming back up the slope. He sounded the recall. His garrison fighters, who had been pressing the inner wall at multiple points for hours, heard the horns and fell back up the plateau road through the oppidum gates. Outside the outer ring, the relief army commanders saw what had happened at Monrea. The diversion had not broken through anywhere. The plan had failed at its hinge. The army broke, not a coordinated withdrawal, but a rapid dispersal. The camp they had built outside Caesar's lines was abandoned. Equipment, food, weapons, everything heavy left behind. Men moved away from the walls as fast as they could, and the Germanic cavalry pursued through the late afternoon and into darkness, cutting into the rearguard until the distance and exhaustion ended the chase. By morning, the plain was empty. The campfires that had given hope to the garrison were cold. 74 Roman military standards, recovered from the abandoned Gallic camp, were returned to their units. Inside the oppidum, nothing remained. No food, no rescue coming, no option not yet tried. Vercingetorix called a council and let every chieftain speak first. The options were plain. Hold the walls and die on them. The Romans would eventually breach a starved and weakened defense, and the end would be a massacre. Surrender to Caesar and accept whatever terms he chose. Or kill Vercingetorix himself and send his body to Caesar as a peace offering in hopes of better terms for the survivors. Each option was put and discussed directly. The men in that room had come from across Gaul to fight for something, and the conversation they were having was about how to give up that something in the way that cost the fewest additional lives. Vercingetorix spoke last. He said he had not led the revolt for personal gain. He had done it for the freedom of Gaul. The outcome had not matched the intention. The council should decide what to do with him. They voted to surrender him. Caesar was seated on his tribunal in front of his camp when the chieftains came down from the plateau the next morning. They laid their weapons and their gold torques at his feet. Then Vercingetorix rode out in his finest armour. This detail survives in Caesar's account, and it is the most significant one in the surrender scene. Not because of the armour, but because of the choice it represents. He had decided how this moment would look. He rode to the tribunal, dismounted, removed his armour and sword, set them in front of Caesar, and sat. He did not speak. Caesar did not speak to him. He was taken in chains. He would not see Gaul again. The morning after the surrender was the first genuinely quiet morning at Alesia in 6 weeks. No sorties from the plateau, no attack on the walls, no sling volleys at the tower crews. The Scorpion ballistae were still, the sentries stood down from alert, and the engineers, who had been repairing wall sections after every engagement, could stop for the first time since the relief army arrived. The quiet had the specific texture of exhaustion, not peace, but the absence of the energy required to continue. Caesar conducted the formal surrender with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that political theatre and military ceremony were the same thing. He sat on his tribunal in full armour, with his senior officers arranged behind him, and his legions in formation on the ground around it. The chieftains of the Gallic coalition came down from the plateau and crossed the Roman lines. They brought the gold torques that marked Gallic aristocratic rank, their decorated swords, their shields, and set them at Caesar's feet. 74 Roman military standards recovered from the abandoned Gallic camp were accounted for and returned to their units. Vercingetorix came last, in his finest armour, rode to the tribunal, dismounted, removed his weapons, and sat. No words. He was taken into custody. Caesar then sorted the prisoners by tribe. This was administration, not sentiment. The Aedui and the Arverni, despite having been the core of the revolt, were the most politically significant tribes in Gaul, and Caesar's thinking was already running ahead to what governing the province would require. He released their senior figures, moved to restore the formal Aeduan alliance, and treated the Arvernian leaders with enough restraint to prevent a permanent enmity that would have made administration difficult. Cold, practical, and effective. The remaining prisoners, warriors from every other tribe that had contributed forces to the coalition or the relief army, were distributed among the surviving legionaries. 1 prisoner per man. The men who had built the walls and manned them and fought the 3 days of assaults took 1 Gallic warrior each as property. Some would be sold in Roman slave markets immediately. Others would remain in their new owner's household. The Roman economy ran on enslaved labour at a structural level, and the Gallic campaigns contributed to that labour pool enormously. Ancient sources suggest the overall number of Gauls enslaved across the 7-year war was in the hundreds of thousands, though exact figures are not reliable. Caesar's casualty figures for the battle itself are not systematic enough to allow modern calculation. He notes the 74 standards from the Gallic camp, describes heavy losses during the pursuit, and mentions the garrison's condition at surrender without providing totals. Modern historians cannot produce defensible aggregate numbers from the ancient evidence. What is clear is that the Roman army, after 6 weeks of construction, supply pressure, and 3 days of fighting on both walls simultaneously, was depleted but operationally intact. The Gallic coalition, garrison and relief force combined, was finished as a military organisation. The fate of the Mandubii civilians, expelled from their own town, refused passage through the Roman lines, trapped in the open no-man's land between 2 armies, is not resolved in any ancient source. Caesar mentions their expulsion. He does not mention them again. That gap in the record is the most complete thing about their story. Vercingetorix was transported to Rome and placed in the Tullianum prison, the subterranean holding cell below the Capitoline Hill used for high-value prisoners awaiting the specific ceremony of a triumph. Subterranean, damp and dark. He was a trophy to be displayed at the proper moment, and that moment was 6 years away. Caesar moved immediately after the administrative work of the surrender was done. He distributed his legions to winter quarters across the territories of the tribes that had just submitted. A deliberate occupation strategy, placing garrisons at the points of maximum political sensitivity to prevent any reconsolidation of resistance before the Gauls had time to recover their strength. He sent forces to the Remi, his most consistently loyal allies throughout the campaign, to protect them from any reprisal by tribes not yet reconciled to the outcome. He drafted dispatches to Rome. The Senate voted him a thanksgiving of 20 days, the longest ever awarded to a Roman general at that point in Roman history. The previous record had been Pompey's 15 days for his eastern campaigns. The comparison was deliberate, and the political message was not lost on anyone in Rome. You have surpassed Pompey. That comparison would matter very soon. Southwest Gaul was not yet fully pacified. In 51 and 50 BC, Caesar fought a final round of reduction campaigns, the siege of Uxellodunum being the most notable, an engagement he ended by having the hands cut from every surviving defender as a permanent demonstration of what continued resistance cost. By 50 BC, organized military resistance across Gaul had ceased. The long wars were over. Gaul was a Roman province. The changes that followed the Battle of Alesia took generations to become fully visible, which is the normal pace for that kind of change. After Alesia, there was no longer any organized resistance to Romanization, and the process ran at whatever speed suited the administration. Caesar set the tone in the first decade after the conquest, granting citizenship to Gallic aristocrats willing to participate in the provincial structure, recruiting Gallic soldiers into Roman auxiliary units, investing in the roads and administrative centres that would make the province productive. The Gallic aristocracy cooperated. Their sons learned Latin. Roman cities grew near the sites of the old oppida. The Druidic order was suppressed over the following century through Roman legal prohibition and the disappearance of the cultural context it required. By the 2nd century AD, it survived only in Ireland and Britain. On the continent, it was gone. The Celtic language of Gaul lasted perhaps 3 centuries in various forms, attested in inscriptions and place names. Then it disappeared as a spoken tongue, replaced by vulgar Latin, which became Old French, which became French, spoken today by 280 million people as a first language, descended in an unbroken linguistic chain from the Latin of Roman Gaul. What Alesia ended was not just a military campaign. It was the last moment at which the Celtic civilization of continental Europe existed as a self-governing cultural entity. The religious organization, the tribal political structure, the oral tradition, the specific relationship between land and people and the sacred, all of it ended here. What replaced it was Roman, then Christian Roman, then medieval, then modern European. The shape of all of that traces back to this plateau. What the battle did to Caesar's own trajectory is almost equally consequential. The Gallic campaigns had made him the most dangerous man in the Republic. His legions were loyal to him personally after 7 years of shared victory, not to Rome in the abstract, not to the Senate. His wealth from Gallic plunder funded indefinite political activity. His military reputation now exceeded Pompey's. In January 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and triggered the civil war that ended the Roman Republic. The dictatorship, the assassination in 44 BC, the subsequent civil wars, the emergence of Augustus and the Principate. Every event in that sequence was powered by the resources, the army, and the reputation the Gallic campaigns produced. Without Alesia, there is no Rubicon. Without the Rubicon, there is no Augustus. The political shape of the next 5 centuries of European history runs through this plateau in Burgundy. In 46 BC, Vercingetorix was brought up from the Tullianum and walked through the streets of Rome in chains behind Caesar's triumph chariot. At the end of the procession, he was taken aside and strangled, standard Roman practice for a captured enemy king after a triumph. It was almost certainly the first full daylight he had seen in 6 years. In 1865, Napoleon III commissioned an enormous bronze statue of Vercingetorix, placed at the highest point of Montauxoir. It still stands there, gazing west across the plain of Les Laumes. Napoleon III wrote the inscription himself. Gaul united, forming a single nation, animated by a common spirit, can defy the universe. He identified with the man who lost. Today, the site is the village of Alise-Saint-Reine in Burgundy. Quiet, surrounded by vineyards, with a museum at the base of the hill where aerial photographs show the ghost lines of Caesar's ditches still pressed into the earth 2,000 years later. Faint depressions, visible only from above, only in the right light, only in the right season. The outline of the 2 rings that held the ancient world in balance for 6 weeks. The Romans filled those ditches in, but the shape of Europe, its languages, its laws, its cities, the Latin roots buried in French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, was poured into a mould that Caesar hammered together here, on this hill, in 6 weeks, in the late summer of 52 BC. And so the story closes. But hey, if you're still here right now, still watching, after everything we just walked through together, then something in this touched you. Maybe you felt it in the way Caesar refused to flinch when the odds were impossible. Maybe you felt it in Vercingetorix, a man who gave everything for something larger than himself and still lost, and yet chose, in his final moment, to walk out with his head up. Here's what history quietly teaches us, not as a lesson, but as a mirror. The philosopher Seneca once wrote that difficulties strengthen the mind the same way labour strengthens the body. Caesar didn't win at Alesia because he was lucky. He won because when he was surrounded on every side with no way out, he built walls. He turned his most vulnerable position into his most powerful one. And maybe that's exactly where some of you are right now. Surrounded, running low, feeling the walls close in. The story of Alesia says, that's not the end. That's where the work begins. If this moved something in you, share it with someone who needs it today. Hit like, subscribe, and come back, because the next story we tell together might be the one that changes how you see everything. We'll see you there.